Nobody imagined that the woman abandoned with twin babies in the frozen wilderness would become the missing piece in a lonely Inuit hunter's broken heart. The Arctic wind carried Elena Hartwell's desperate cries across the endless expanse of white, but there was no one left to hear them. Her husband Thomas had been dead for 3 months, claimed by tuberculosis that swept through their remote trading posts like wildfire, consuming dry timber. The disease had taken him slowly, each day stealing a little more of the man she had married until only a shadow remained in their bed, coughing blood into handkerchiefs that she burned each morning to prevent the sickness from spreading to their newborn twins. Elena had nursed Thomas through his final weeks while Emma and Ethan grew in her womb, feeling them kick and move as her father grew weaker. She had delivered the babies herself on a bitter February night when the temperature dropped to 50 below zero, with only Mrs. Patterson from the neighboring cabin to help. Thomas had lived just long enough to hold his son and daughter, whispering their names with his last breath as Elena wept beside him. The other settlers had packed their belongings and fled south before winter could trap them permanently in the wilderness. The trading post that had once bustled with activity became a ghost town almost overnight. Families loaded their possessions into wagons and disappeared over the horizon, leaving behind empty cabins and broken dreams. Elena had pleaded with each departing family to take her and the twins, offering what little money she had saved, promising to work for their passage to civilization. But they saw only burden in a widow with crying infants and no resources to contribute to the dangerous journey ahead. Mrs. Patterson, the settlement's unofficial leader and the closest thing Elena had to a friend, had been brutally honest in her assessment. "We barely have supplies for ourselves, Elena. 3 extra mouths to feed would doom us all. You should have left with the Hendersons when they offered to take just you." The implication hung heavy in the cold air between them, that Elena should abandon her children to save herself. The last wagon had disappeared over the horizon 2 weeks ago, leaving Elena completely alone with her babies in a cabin that grew colder each day as her carefully hoarded firewood dwindled to nothing. She rationed the last of her food with mathematical precision, eating just enough to maintain her milk supply while Emma and Ethan grew thinner and more listless with each passing day. Elena had tried everything she could think of to signal for help. She burned green wood to create smoke signals, fired Thomas's rifle in patterns she hoped might attract attention, even attempted to spell out SOS in the snow using pieces of furniture. But the wilderness stretched for hundreds of miles in every direction, and there was no one within range of her desperate communications. The morning everything changed began like any other nightmare. Elena woke to discover that her meager food stores had been raided during the night by a desperate wolf pack. The heavy wooden door she had barricaded each evening had been clawed open, and the last of her preserved meat was scattered across the cabin floor in a mess of torn packaging and wolf prints. The animals had been systematic in their destruction, consuming or contaminating everything edible they could find. Baby Emma's cries echoed through the small space, her tiny face red with hunger and cold despite the blankets Elena wrapped around her. Ethan lay listlessly in Elena's arms, too weak even to cry properly, his breathing shallow and irregular. Elena realized with crystal clarity that they would all be dead within days if she remained in the cabin waiting for rescue that would never come. She had heard traders mention an Inuit village somewhere to the north, but the details were vague and the distance uncertain. Some said it was 20 miles through terrain that had killed experienced hunters. Others claimed it was closer, but warned that the Inuit were hostile to white settlers, especially lone women with children. Elena weighed these uncertain risks against the absolute certainty of death by starvation and chose movements over surrender. She fashioned a crude sled from cabinet doors and rope, creating a makeshift shelter for the babies using every blanket and piece of canvas she could find. The contraption was clumsy and heavy, but it would protect Emma and Ethan from the wind while allowing her to pull them across the snow. Elena packed what remained of her supplies,
a handful of hardtack biscuits, a partially frozen canteen of water, Thomas's hunting knife, and a few dry matches wrapped in oilcloth. The weight of pulling the sled through deep snow was enormous, but Elena discovered reserves of strength she never knew she possessed. Love for her children burned hotter than the Arctic cold, driving her forward when her body screamed for rest. She talked to Emma and Ethan constantly as she struggled through the drifts, her voice hoarse from the dry air, telling them stories about their father and promising them that somehow they would all survive this nightmare together. Thomas had been a gentleman, a dreamer who believed that the frontier offered opportunities that civilized society denied to people of modest means. He had read about the fur trade and convinced Elena that they could build a prosperous life in the wilderness, trading with Indians and trappers while raising their children in the clean air and freedom of the North. The reality had been harder than either of them anticipated, but Elena had never regretted following him into the unknown. Now she was following her own instincts into an even more dangerous unknown, with no guide except the stories told by men who might have been lying or mistaken. She navigated by the sun during the day and by the stars at night, hoping her general northward direction would eventually lead her to the village that might or might not exist.
By the second day of travel, Elena's world had narrowed to just the next step, then the next after that. Her feet were numbed inside her boots, and she could no longer feel her fingers despite the mittens Thomas had sewn for her from rabbit fur. The twins had grown ominously quiet, their breathing shallow and irregular. Elena forced herself to stop every few hours to check on them, melting snow in her mouth to give them drops of water and singing lullabies to keep them alert and fighting. She found shelter on the second night in the lee of a boulder formation that blocked some of the wind. Elena built a small fire using the last of her matches and the driest wood she could scavenge, carefully rationing the fuel to last through the darkest hours. The babies stirred when the warmth reached them, Emma crying weakly while Ethan remained frighteningly still. Elena held them both against her body, sharing what little heat she could generate while trying not to think about what would happen when her strength finally gave out. The blizzard struck on the third day like a living thing, intent on their destruction. Elena woke to wind gusting at what felt like hurricane force, creating whiteout conditions where she couldn't see her own hands extended in front of her face. The snow was too fine and dry to build any kind of shelter, and the wind was strong enough to knock her down when she tried to stand upright. Elena pulled the sled into the partial lee of a small hill and tried to create some kind of windbreak using her body and the makeshift cover she had brought. Within an hour, they were all buried under drifting snow that threatened to suffocate them. Elena used Thomas's knife to cut air holes in the accumulating drift, fighting panic as the white walls closed in around them. She held her babies against her chest, feeling their tiny hearts beating weakly against her ribs like trapped birds. Elena sang every lullaby she knew, then started over and sang them again, her voice barely audible above the howling wind that seemed determined to drown out every human sound. When Emma stirred and opened her eyes, Elena felt a surge of desperate hope. But Ethan remained frighteningly still, his lips tinged with blue that no amount of rubbing could warm away. Elena found herself praying with an intensity she had never experienced, bargaining with God for her children's lives and offering her own in exchange. She promised to be a better mother, a better person, to dedicate her life to good works if only Emma and Ethan could survive this ordeal. The prayers became a chant that helped her stay conscious as hypothermia began to cloud her thinking and make her limbs feel heavy and distant. Meanwhile, 20 miles away, Nuka was experiencing an uneasiness that had plagued him for 3 days and nights. The 35-year-old hunter had lived alone for 7 years, ever since his wife, Siku, died in childbirth along with their son during one of the worst winters in tribal memory. He had chosen isolation after that loss, building his cabin far from the main village where he wouldn't have to watch other men's children grow up, while his own remained forever buried beneath the permafrost. Nuka had been an excellent father during the brief time his son lived, all of 6 hours that felt like both an eternity and an instant. He had held the tiny boy, noting his perfect fingers and toes, the way his eyes seemed to focus on his father's face with startling intelligence. When death claimed both mother and child, Nuka felt something inside him die as well, something that had never fully healed despite the passing years. The other hunters in his village respected his choice to live apart, understanding that some griefs cut too deep for community comfort to heal. They included him in their hunts when he chose to participate and left him alone when solitude was what he needed. Elder Yuki, the village's most respected healer and spiritual guide, visited him occasionally to ensure he hadn't completely severed his connections to the living world. Nuka was checking his trap lines when the feeling of unrest intensified into something approaching panic. The caribou were acting strangely, bunching together and staring southward toward the abandoned trading post that had been empty for months. His dogs whined and paced despite his commands to settle, their behavior growing more agitated as the day wore on. Even the ravens seemed disturbed, circling overhead and calling in patterns he had never heard before in decades of wilderness life. Elder Yuki had taught him as a boy to listen when the spirit world tried to communicate through the behavior of animals. "The land speaks to those who know how to hear," she would say, while mixing her healing herbs and teaching him to read the subtle signs that predicted weather changes and animal movements. "But you must be quiet inside your heart to understand the message that is being sent to you." Nuka had always been a good listener, perhaps because his grief had hollowed out space inside him where whispers could echo and be heard. The message that afternoon was unmistakable and urgent. Something or someone needed help desperately, and the need was connected to the direction his dogs kept staring. Every instinct he had developed during his years of solitary hunting told him that lives hung in the balance. He loaded his strongest sled with emergency supplies, dried meat, warm furs, medical herbs Elder Yuki had taught him to use, and the portable shelter that could mean the difference between life and death in a blizzard. Nuka harnessed his most reliable dogs, choosing animals he trusted with his life when conditions became dangerous. His lead dog, Anyu, immediately turned toward the old trading post without any command from him, confirming what Nuka already knew in his bones. They traveled through the night, the dog's superior instincts guiding them through terrain that would have been impossible for a human to navigate by sight alone. Nuka had traveled this route before when he occasionally traded with the settlers, but never in conditions this severe. The storm that was battering Elena and her babies was just beginning to reach his area, and he knew that time was running out for whoever was in trouble. The dogs worked tirelessly through the blizzard, their thick coats protecting them from cold that would have killed an unprepared human in minutes. Nuka trusted their judgment completely, knowing that they could detect scents and sounds that were beyond his human senses. When Anyu suddenly stopped and began digging frantically at what appeared to be just another snowdrift, Nuka knew they had found what they were looking for. His heart stopped when he uncovered the makeshift shelter Elena had tried to build. Underneath the accumulated snow, he discovered a woman and two tiny babies, all three unconscious and blue with cold that indicated the final stages of hypothermia. Nuka had seen death by freezing before and knew that minutes or even seconds might make the difference between life and permanent loss. Elena stirred when Nuka lifted her from the drift, and their eyes met for the first time in what would become the most important moment of both their lives. Later, she would tell people that looking into his face was like seeing sunrise after the longest night of her life, like discovering that hope still existed when she had given up all possibility of rescue. There was no judgment in his expression, no calculation about burden or inconvenience or the complications her presence might create. She saw only profound relief that he had found them in time, and the gentleness that made her want to weep with gratitude. His face was weathered by years of outdoor life, marked by small scars from hunting accidents and the deep lines that came from squinting against snow glare. But his eyes held a kindness that spoke of someone who understood suffering and chose compassion as his response to it. "Your babies," Elena whispered through lips so cracked and swollen they barely functioned. "Please, save my babies."
Nuka was already moving with the swift efficiency of someone who had dealt with medical emergencies in conditions where hesitation meant death. He wrapped Emma and Ethan in warm furs from his sled and held them against his body to share his heat, checking their breathing and heartbeats with hands that were gentle despite their strength. He had delivered calves and puppies, assisted with difficult births among the village women when Elder Uniki needed help, but never worked with human babies this close to death. Yet something deep and primal guided his actions as he worked to restore circulation to their tiny limbs and warm their core body temperature, without causing the shock that could stop their hearts. Emma responded immediately to the warmth, her color improving and her cries growing stronger. Ethan remained dangerously still, but Nuka could feel the faint flutter of life in his tiny chest and refused to give up hope.
The journey back to Nuka's cabin required every bit of skill and experience he had accumulated during his years of wilderness survival. He built a temporary shelter using techniques passed down through generations of Inuit hunters, creating a space where Elena could regain enough strength to travel while he worked to stabilize the baby's condition. Nuka fed Elena warm broth made from dried meat and fat that would restore her energy and help her body begin producing milk again. He showed her how to hold the babies against her skin to share body heat most effectively, and taught her to recognize the signs of returning circulation that meant they were winning the battle against hypothermia. "You were meant to be a father," Elena observed as she watched him coax Ethan to take a few drops of warm caribou milk from a carved spoon no bigger than a thimble. Something shifted in Nuka's expression, pain and longing replacing the calm competence he had shown while treating them. "I was going to be," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of loss that resonated with Elena's own grief. But the spirits decided otherwise. Elena heard the depth of sorrow in his voice and understood immediately that she wasn't the only one carrying the burden of dreams that had died with the people they loved. They were two broken people thrown together by circumstances that would have destroyed them separately, but somehow made them stronger when they faced them together. When they finally reached Nuka's cabin after another day of careful travel, Elena felt like she was entering a sanctuary that had been prepared specifically for their arrival. The space was larger and warmer than she had expected, built with the expertise of someone who understood how to create comfort in one of the world's most hostile environments. A massive stone fireplace dominated the main room, radiating heat that penetrated every corner and filled the space with golden light. Animal furs covered the walls and floors, creating insulation against cold while providing an atmosphere of comfort that was distinctly masculine but somehow welcoming to a woman and children who had known only hardship for months. Most importantly for Elena's immediate concerns, it was warm enough that Emma and Ethan could sleep without being bundled in every available covering, allowing their bodies to finally relax and begin the healing process. Nuka gave Elena his own bed without hesitation, creating a sleeping space for himself near the fire where he could tend the flames through the night and respond immediately if the babies needed attention. He fashioned cribs for Emma and Ethan from large carved bowls lined with the softest rabbit fur Elena had ever felt, and she watched in wonder as her children relaxed completely for the first time since Thomas died. The constant tension of cold and hunger finally left their tiny bodies, and they slept the deep sleep of complete safety. Elena found herself crying as she watched them, overwhelmed by gratitude and the realization that they had survived against odds that should have been impossible to overcome. Someone had cared enough to risk his own life in a blizzard to save 3 strangers, and that someone was now treating them with a hospitality that asked for nothing in return. Over the following weeks, an unusual but comfortable household routine developed around the needs of the babies and the requirements of survival in the Arctic winter. Nuka would arrive before dawn to check his traps and hunt for fresh meat, activities that required him to travel considerable distances in conditions that would challenge even experienced outdoorsmen. He always returned by midday to help Elena with Emma and Ethan, sharing the work of feeding, cleaning, and entertaining 2 active infants. Elena discovered that Nuka possessed remarkable patience and intuitive understanding when it came to caring for children. Perhaps because he approached their needs with the same careful attention he gave to tracking animals or reading weather signs.
He seemed to know exactly what they required before they became fussy or uncomfortable. He moved through the tasks of childcare with quiet competence, never showing irritation even when the babies were particularly demanding. Emma seemed particularly drawn to him from the beginning, reaching for his hands whenever he came near and settling most easily when he held her against his chest. She would babble contentedly while he worked on his various projects, apparently fascinated by the steady rhythm of his breathing and the deep rumble of his voice when he spoke to her in soft Inuit words. Ethan, still fragile from their ordeal in the storm and slower to recover his strength, required more delicate care and constant monitoring. But Nuka proved endlessly patient with the difficult baby, never showing frustration when Ethan rejected food or cried for hours despite every effort to comfort him. He carved tiny toys from scraps of wood and bone, creating a mobile that hung above their cribs and cast dancing shadows in the firelight that never failed to capture both babies' attention. Elena found herself watching Nuka with growing admiration and something deeper she wasn't ready to name or acknowledge. He moved through his daily tasks with quiet efficiency, never complaining about the extra work that 3 additional people brought to his orderly life or suggesting that their presence was anything other than welcome. When the babies cried at night, he would wake immediately and help Elena tend to them, never showing irritation even when exhaustion made them all short-tempered. But it was the small, unrequested gestures that began to rebuild Elena's faith in human kindness after months of experiencing only abandonment and rejection. Nuka would save the choicest pieces of meat for her, ensuring she had the nutrition needed to maintain her strength and milk supply.
He crafted warmer, more practical clothes for all of them from his extensive store of prepared furs, working by firelight long after Elena had fallen asleep with her children. Most touchingly, he began teaching her Inuit words for the things they needed each day, patiently correcting her pronunciation and celebrating her progress with genuine pleasure. The language lessons became a bridge between their different worlds, allowing them to communicate more effectively while sharing something of his culture with someone who showed genuine interest in understanding it. Anna, he would say, pointing to Elena. Woman. Nuka, she would respond, touching his arm lightly. Man. Pikusivit, he would gesture toward the babies. Your children. But one evening, as Elena nursed Ethan while Emma slept peacefully in Nuka's arms, he said something that made her breath catch and her heart begin racing. Pikusivut, he whispered, looking down at Emma's sleeping face with an expression of tender devotion. Our children. Elena's heart began beating so hard she was certain he could hear it across the room. The possessive pronoun hung in the warm air between them, heavy with implications that neither was ready to discuss openly, but both understood perfectly. The word had been spoken, and it changed everything about how they saw their strange arrangement and the future that was slowly taking shape around them. Winter deepened with a ferocity that made Elena grateful every day for the safety of Nuka's cabin, and the outside world disappeared behind walls of snow and ice that would have made travel impossible even if they had somewhere to go. Inside their warm sanctuary, something precious and unexpected was growing between 4 people who had found each other against impossible odds. Elena discovered that Nuka was not the stern, silent man she had initially assumed when he emerged from the blizzard like a figure from legend. In the evenings, while they worked on the various tasks that kept them fed and warm, he told stories that revealed a quick wit and deep appreciation for the ridiculous situations that wilderness life could create. His tales of hunting adventures and childhood memories made her laugh despite everything she had lost, reminding her that joy could still exist even in the aftermath of tragedy. In return, Elena shared her own history, talking about Thomas and their dreams of building a prosperous life on the frontier, about the trading post that had been their home until death and abandonment left her with nothing but 2 babies and fierce determination to survive. She spoke about her childhood in a small Ohio town where her parents had run a general store, about the education that had prepared her for a civilized life, but proved useless when civilization disappeared and left her to face the wilderness alone. Nuka listened to her stories without judgment,
occasionally asking questions that showed he understood not just the events she described, but the emotions that accompanied them. His questions revealed an intelligence and sensitivity that surprised Elena, who had unconsciously accepted the stereotypes about indigenous people that were common among white settlers. Thomas was a good man, Nuka said one evening as they sat watching the twins play on soft fur spread before the fire. Emma had begun crawling and was exploring everything within reach with fearless curiosity, while Ethan sat supported by rolled blankets, reaching for the wooden toys Nuka carved for him with increasing skill and ambition. He was, Elena agreed, watching Ethan's determined efforts to grasp a carved polar bear that was slightly beyond his reach. But he's gone, and I can't live in the past anymore. These babies need me to look forward, not backward. What do you see when you look forward? Nuka asked, his voice carefully neutral despite the obvious importance of her answer. Elena looked around the cabin that had become more home to her than anywhere she had ever lived. The walls were decorated with tools and weapons that served practical purposes, but also showed artistic sensibility in their creation. Nuka's belongings reflected a life lived with intentionality and respect for the materials that survival required. She looked at him, whose quiet strength had become her anchor in a world that had tried to destroy her and her children. She looked at Emma and Ethan, thriving under the care of a man who loved them as fiercely as if they carried his own blood. I see family, she said simply. I see home. The confession hung between them like a bridge neither was completely sure they should cross. They had been careful to maintain appropriate boundaries during their weeks together, sleeping in separate areas of the cabin and avoiding discussions about their future beyond the immediate needs of survival. But spring was still months away, and Elena knew that decisions would have to be made about what happened when the world became accessible again and choices had to be confronted. It was Elder Yunaki who forced the conversation they had both been avoiding. The old woman arrived during a brief break in the weather that had lasted for nearly a week, traveling by dog sled from the main village with supplies and news from the outside world. She took one look at the domestic scene in Nuka's cabin and nodded with the satisfaction of someone whose expectations had been confirmed. The spirits have been busy, she observed, settling herself comfortably near the fire and accepting the tea that Elena offered with automatic hospitality. I felt a change in the wind weeks ago, when the storm brought new possibilities to our land. The earth was singing about new beginnings and second chances. Elder Yunaki was a small woman, whose age was impossible to determine, though everyone agreed she had been old when their grandparents were children. Her face was mapped with lines that spoke of decades spent outdoors in harsh conditions, but her eyes remained bright with intelligence and humor that made her seem somehow timeless. She moved with a careful precision of someone whose body had learned to conserve energy while her mind remained sharp and observant. She examined Emma and Ethan with a practiced eye of someone who had delivered dozens of babies and raised even more over her long life. Emma charmed her immediately, babbling happily and reaching for the old woman's elaborately carved jewelry with the fearlessness of a child who had never learned to be afraid of strangers. Ethan was more reserved in his approach, but he allowed Erky to hold him without fussing, which she took as a sign of good character and sound judgment. "Strong babies," she pronounced after her thorough examination. "They will grow well in this land if they are allowed to stay and become part of it." "Their mother might return to her own people when spring comes," Noka said carefully, not looking at Elena as he spoke the words that had been haunting both of them. "Might she?" Erky's eyes crinkled with amusement that suggested she found the suggestion ridiculous. And what would she return to? Empty cabins and abandoned hopes? People who left her to die rather than share their resources? Here, she has purpose that grows stronger each day. Here, the babies have a father who loves them without reservation. Elena felt heat rising in her cheeks at the old woman's direct assessment of their situation. Erky saw too much, understood too clearly what Elena herself was only beginning to acknowledge about the depth of feeling that had developed during their weeks of shared domesticity. "It's complicated," Elena murmured, thinking about the social expectations and moral judgments that her background had taught her to consider. There are proper ways of doing things, expectations about mourning periods, and appropriate behavior. Proper according to who? Erky challenged with the directness of someone old enough to have earned the right to speak uncomfortable truths. Your people who left you to die in the wilderness? My people would say the spirits brought you together for reasons we don't need to question or justify to others. When the land provides exactly what is needed at the moment it is needed most, we don't argue with the gift or worry about whether others approve of how we receive it. That night, after Elder Erky had settled into the spare sleeping space that Nuka prepared for her with extra furs and careful attention to her comfort, Elena found herself unable to sleep despite her exhaustion. She stood by the small window, looking out at stars so bright and numerous they seemed close enough to touch. The aurora borealis danced across the sky in sheets of green and blue light, creating a display of natural beauty that took her breath away and made her feel connected to something larger than her individual concerns. Elena, Nuka's voice was soft behind her, and she turned to find him standing in the doorway of his sleeping alcove, concern evident in his expression. "Are you well? Do the babies need something?" "I'm thinking," she said, wrapping her arms around herself for warmth,
"About what Elder Umuki said today, about spirits and gifts and proper ways of living." "And what do you think?" he asked, moving closer but maintaining the respectful distance they had established. Elena looked toward the improvised cribs where Emma and Ethan slept peacefully, their breathing regular and healthy for the first time since Thomas died. In the months since becoming a widow, she had learned that love wasn't always convenient or conventional, that survival sometimes required choices that proper society might not approve of. She loved her babies enough to trek 20 miles through Arctic wilderness with no guarantee of survival. She loved them enough to accept help from a stranger who had every reason to turn her away. And somewhere in the quiet routine of their days, somewhere between the shared meals and collaborative childcare and evening conversations that had become the foundation of their domestic life, she had begun to love the man who had saved them all and asked for nothing in return except the privilege of sharing their lives and calling their children his own. "I think," Elena said slowly, choosing her words carefully, "that I've spent too much time worrying about what other people would consider proper, and not enough time thinking about what would make us happy." "Us?" Nuka stepped closer, hope and uncertainty warring in his expression. "You, me, Emma, and Ethan," Elena clarified, meeting his eyes directly for the first time since the conversation began. "If you want us to stay. If you want to be their father and my—" She hesitated, the words seeming too big and precious to speak carelessly. "Your husband," Nuka finished, softly, his voice rough with emotion. "Yes, Elena, I want all of that more than I have ever wanted anything in my life." The kiss they shared was gentle and tentative, the first physical expression of feelings that had been growing steadily for months, but had been held in check by uncertainty about the future and respect for the boundaries that grief and caution had created. When they separated, Elena rested her forehead against Nuka's chest and listened to the steady heartbeat that had become the rhythm of her new life. "I love you," she whispered, the admission feeling both terrifying and inevitable. "I didn't think I could love anyone again after Thomas, but you've shown me that the heart has room for more than we imagine possible." "I love you too," Nuka replied, his arms tightening around her with careful strength. "All of you. Emma and Ethan are as much my children as if I had been there when they were born, as if I had helped create them." Elder Umuki performed their marriage ceremony the following morning. A simple but profound ritual that bound them together according to traditions that were older than any government or church. There were no witnesses except the babies and the vast wilderness surrounding them, but Elena felt the weight of the vows as deeply as if they had been spoken in a cathedral before hundreds of people. "In the eyes of the spirits and this community, you are now one family," Uki pronounced, her aged voice carrying the authority of someone who had officiated at dozens of such ceremonies. "May your love grow stronger with each season that passes, and may your children carry the best of both worlds in their hearts as they grow to adulthood." That evening, as Elena and Nuka sat together watching their children play on the furs before the fire, she marveled at how completely her life had changed in less than a year.
12 months earlier, she had been planning a future that included Thomas and their unborn children in a trading post that seemed permanent and secure. 6 months earlier, she had been a widow with no hope and no future, abandoned by everyone she had counted as friends and facing certain death in the wilderness. Now she was a wife again, mother to 2 thriving babies who showed no signs of the trauma they had endured, and part of a community that had welcomed her without reservation or conditions. The transformation seemed too remarkable to be real, yet the evidence surrounded her in the form of a warm home, a loving husband, and children who had never been happier or healthier. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked Nuka as he carved a new toy for Ethan, who was showing increasing signs of following his sister's adventurous and fearless spirit. "Taking on someone else's children, changing your entire life for strangers you had never seen before that day in the storm." Nuka set down his knife and looked at her with an expression of such tenderness that Elena felt tears stinging her eyes despite her happiness. "I regret only that it took so long for the spirits to bring you to me," he said with absolute sincerity. "Emma and Ethan are not someone else's children. They are ours, as surely as if we had created them together from our own love. And you were never a stranger to my heart. You were the missing piece I didn't know I was looking for." As winter finally began to loosen its grip on the land and the first hints of spring appeared in longer days and warmer winds, Elena realized that being abandoned in the Arctic wilderness had not been the end of her story, but the beginning of a new chapter she could never have imagined. The woman who had been left to die had become the center of a family that functioned with a love deeper and more resilient than anything she had known before. Emma and Ethan grew strong and healthy under the care of 2 parents who adored them and a community that welcomed them as full members despite their mixed heritage. They learned to speak English and Inuit with equal fluency, moving between cultures as easily as they moved between their mother's arms and their father's embrace. Elena discovered that she had a natural talent for the traditional crafts that Elder Uki taught her, and her work became valued throughout the village for its beauty and practical usefulness. But perhaps most remarkably, Elena learned that true love could strike more than once in a single lifetime if the heart remained open to possibilities that seemed impossible until they became reality. The love she had shared with Thomas had been real and precious, but it belonged to her youth and the person she had been before loss taught her about resilience. The love she shared with Nuka was deeper and stronger, forged in adversity and strengthened by the daily choice to build a life together despite obstacles that could have destroyed them separately. Years later, when Emma and Ethan had children of their own, and the story of their parents' meeting had become family legend told around fires during the longest nights of winter, Elena would still marvel at the chain of events that brought them together. Thomas's death, the abandonment by the other settlers, the desperate journey through the storm, Nuka's decision to follow his instincts into the wilderness despite the danger. Each tragedy had been necessary to create the miracle of their family. Nobody could have imagined that the woman abandoned with twin babies in the frozen wilderness would become the missing piece in a lonely Inuit hunter's broken heart. But the Arctic had its own wisdom about survival and love. And sometimes the cruelest abandonment becomes the path to the most unexpected salvation.